In fact, we're going to get started right now in the interest of time, and want to welcome everybody here on a beautiful Kansas City Chiefs morning. I really, unfortunately, all my Chiefs wear is sweatshirts and hoodies, so I really wanted to represent today. But on that front, I hope we have an excellent weekend. So I'm Brent Never. I am director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership here at UMKC, and we're just so happy to have you here today for our legislative update. This is a session that is put on by the Midwest Center, and a great time for our nonprofit leaders here in the Kansas City region to understand what is happening in Topeka and Jeff City. Today we have a wonderful group of professionals from both of our state capitals, and I'll give you a rundown of how this will work today. We'll do brief introductions, then we're going to have questions that we've prepared here at the Midwest Center for about the first half an hour. If you have a question as a participant, I want you to go ahead and pop it in the chat. And then after those first initial questions, we're going to start in on the other questions. If you have something that's really burning and that you have to get some clarification, please flag that also in the chat. So sometimes somebody will say something and you'll say, I didn't catch what that just was. Throw it in the chat and we'll be able to pick that up for you. So with that, let's get started. So our guests today are from both Topeka and from Jeff City, or Missouri and Kansas, I should say. So first off, we have Stephen Duerst. Stephen is with Federico Duerst, which is a firm that specializes on work, particularly in Topeka for today's discussion. Stephen is an attorney, highly active in government affairs and lobbying, political campaigns, consulting, and business development. Previously to his work in Topeka, he worked with Cowen Strategies, which is now considered one of Washington, D.C.'s premier boutique consulting firms. Prior to his consulting work, Stephen was hired at the Republican National Committee to assist the organization in its fundraising efforts. Stephen, along with his colleagues, raised record funds at the RNC to position the GOP financially ahead of the 2012 U.S. presidential election. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We'll forgive him for that because he also got his JD from the University of Kansas. Next, we have John Federico. And John also is an attorney and an experienced government affairs and public relations consultant. John was identified by Ingram magazine as one of the original 50 most influential Kansans. As one of the most respected lobbyists in Kansas, Federico is most proficient at strategic planning and communicating with elected officials and regulators on a variety of levels. John has invested an enormous amount of time and energy into developing meaningful relationships with all members of the legislature and executive branch. John's native of Rhode Island. I'm a New Englander too. But earned his law degree from Washburn University. All right, and we have Jeremy Lefevre. Jeremy has nearly 2 decades of experience in public policy and public affairs, experience in several states. Jeremy began his career with the New Mexico legislature as a research and bill drafter. He moved to Kansas City in 2009 and was the policy director for a statewide advocacy organization. Jeremy served in the Missouri House of Representatives for 2 full terms. He sat on the powerful Budget Committee, the Speaker's Committee on Emerging Issues, and Small Business Committee. Jeremy's primary areas of practice are education, tax, and budget policy. And he went to K-State. All right, last but not least, Sam Panettiere. Sam has spent over 17 years of experience in public policy and public affairs. Prior to lobbying at the state capitol in Jeff City, Panettiere, or Sam, I should say, served as district director for U.S. Senator Kit Bond. In addition to his experience with public policy, he has collaborated and consulted with various political campaigns. In 2008, Sam served as the deputy political director in Missouri for the presidential campaign of U.S. Senator John McCain, winning the only one of 12 targeted states in that cycle. Sam is a graduate of Northwest Missouri State University. So it's great to have everybody here. And as you can tell, everybody, this is a wonderful panel with a lot of experience in both of our states. So what I wanted to do is to turn to each of our four members. We'll start with John. Just for a 3-minute high level, what do you see going on right now in Topeka? And then we'll move on to Stephen.
Thanks, Dr. Never. Stephen and I can certainly tag team on that, but glad to join you all. And as I look at who's on the screen with Sam and Jeremy, you've got some legends there, and here's a Jayhawk mug in your honor to our friends to the east. John Federico, Stephen Duerst has introduced. We appreciate that, those flattering introductions. This is, I'm in the midst of my 31st legislative session, which explains the liquor in the mug and the gray hair. I'm just kidding, of course. And I've seen a lot change over here. Kansas is quite a bit different than the Missouri legislature, not only in the makeup, but how we go about our business. I think most striking is I think we start about the same time every year in January, but on the Kansas side, there is no fixed date to end. There is no date certain when that legislative session is going to end, when they're going to finish their business. This year, as we started the 2024 session, it is an election year for all 40 Kansas senators and all 125 House members. In Kansas, we don't stagger our elections. And so that prompted legislative leaders from both the House and the Senate to say that we're going to be very focused on what we're going to consider this year, and we're going to try to get out of here in a very timely manner. And what that means, we're not quite sure. It changes week to week. I'll turn it over to Stephen to talk about the legislative session and some highlights of where we are on certain significant pieces of policy.
Yeah, good morning. Appreciate the time. Again, as John noted, it's an election year. So really the issues are narrowly focused, and they are priorities of both the governor and the legislature. I think that the legislature has two main priorities. One is to make sure that their spending is in check, despite the fact that we have an over $3 billion surplus in the state of Kansas. The governor proposed her budget. That is being worked currently. There are a number of one-time projects that the governor would like to see go through, and we'll see if the legislature is receptive to those projects. The other major issue that legislative leadership would like to see pass is a flat or fair tax, a single rate tax. They had two main tax bills last session. Both were vetoed by the governor, and the legislature failed to attempt or override her. In particular, they came up one vote short because of a senator that flipped on this flat tax package last session. So that's a massive issue that has really held everything up to this point. Medicaid expansion continues to be a huge priority for the governor, and she's pulling out all the stops. I know we'll get into that a little bit later, so I'll leave that there. And then again, like any election year, you see bills introduced at a high level. We are well over 1,000 bills introduced over the biennium. I think in the last 2 days we've had 150. So when you see something come out that is alarming, Just know that, again, it's an election year, and these legislators want to go back and say, I filed that bill to set the state color as red or blue or whatever it might be, whatever crazy idea they have. But those are really the dominating issues, and I know we'll get into some more, so I'll leave it from there. But happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. Again, appreciate the time.
Yeah,
Doctor,
thanks.
I just might mention that we represent 8 different not-for-profit organizations. So as we have conversations down the road, and we're a staff of 5 people, 5 diverse lobbyists, of diverse in our geography, diverse in our politics, and then we, during every legislative session, bring in anywhere from 6 to 8 people that are law clerks or poli-sci majors from the University of Kansas, Washburn University, and K-State to help us keep an eye on things that are going on over there. Because, as Stephen said, it's a high volume of bills and most aren't going to get the time. But you also want to make sure that you are keeping your eye on things that might all of a sudden become of concern to our, I think we have 58 clients. So anyway, it's a lot. It's a unique system, but it's our representation of the not-for-profits, I think, puts us in a unique position to go over there and advocate for things that really matter.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, John. And we're going to get into the nonprofit angle real quick here. But Jeremy, how about you on the Jeff City and Missouri side?
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting differences between Kansas and Missouri that do offer up kind of unique ways of how nonprofits and others interact with the legislature. I think chief among them is that Missouri is a term limited state. Kansas is not a term limited state. The terms are 2 4-year terms in the Senate and 4 2-year terms in the House. So you can do 8 and 8, but I've heard senators describe it as 4 years of I don't know, followed by 4 years of I don't care. And so you think that not only is that 8 years a long period, it sounds like a long period of time, but what that means is your committee chairs and your leadership are really only influential and effective there for a couple of years. Sometimes you get somebody that ascends to leadership early and they're there for 4 years, but for the most part, there's just this constant churn of lawmakers. It presents challenges because that means you always have to educate people, and you're fighting the same battles that you fought 6 years ago because people come in with bright, fresh new ideas that are the same bright, fresh new ideas that somebody else had a few years ago. On the good side is you get a pain in the neck committee chairman that is obstinate and blocking some things that you want to do. Wait them out for a couple of years and try to advocate and get your person into that slot in the next year. So there's some interesting things there. From a practical standpoint, the way lobbyists work, it is an interesting component that Missouri doesn't allow any lobbyist gifts. Kansas has a handful of restrictions and they have unlimited food and beverage. Missouri used to have unlimited food and beverage, which allowed lobbyists like us to, if you invite somebody out to dinner, you pick up their tab. Not having that, my observation of it has been that it has clicked up lawmakers much more, where Democrats hang out with Democrats, Republicans hang out with Republicans, lobbyists who like certain people hang out with those people, because if it's your own money and you have to go out and do stuff with folks, you're going to surround yourself with the people you want to surround yourself with. And so the unintended negative consequence of that has been that you don't get as much cross the aisle and as much camaraderie as I feel like we had prior to that. A couple other interesting things. I have found, I work in Kansas as well. I have found that Kansas is much more staff reliant. They have a very professional, high octane legislative staff, and they're very engaged and involved in the drafting process and the committee process. And they have the legislative audit, and they conduct very professional, high level research on behalf of the legislature and the legislative body. Missouri is basically, they're all mostly politically appointed. They have 2 legislative drafting bodies. So the way somebody will draft a bill in the Senate is going to be a little bit different than the way somebody's going to draft the bill in the House. And when I worked in every other state I've worked in, there's one legislative drafting unit. So that creates some challenges in Missouri. It makes it so that you've got, in my view, you've got to have more. There's a reliance on those lobbyists and those relationships with the lawmakers because they drive the entire process. Whereas in Kansas, some of those staff who have the institutional knowledge, the lawmakers really lean on them a lot as well. The last thing I'll say, and I don't know what drives this. Maybe John and his partner can expand on this a little bit. But I have found that Kansas is really, really heavy on in-house staff. So folks that are government affairs staff for companies or nonprofits or foundations, those folks spend a lot of time in the building, and there aren't as many contract lobbyists like us. And in Missouri, there's just not very many in-house people that hang out around the Capitol. By and large, it's contract lobbyists, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of us. The last thing I'll mention is the transparency between the two is really kind of interesting. Kansas will put out their committee agendas the week prior. There's always a couple things that pop up here and there, but you pretty much know by day to day what's going to happen, what committees are happening, where you need to be, and what's going to happen. Now, there's the conversations that need to happen, but Missouri, we will drop anything with 24 hours notice, and we do floor subs and committee subs and amendments to substitutes that are hundreds of pages long without any heads up notice. And so on the Missouri side, it just creates that, that it's important to have everybody, hanging out in committees and everywhere you are, because at the drop of a hat, things can change quickly. So those are some of the things I wanted to highlight between the two. I probably took up more time than I deserved, but I'll throw it over to Sam for his thoughts there.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. It's fascinating stuff. I love to sort of see that contrast. So Sam.
Yeah, so Jeremy did a good job of pointing out some of the distinctions between the two states. Ending with the kind of liberal amendment process that Missouri has, that's kind of wild west, if you will. It's less rigid and structured as Kansas, I'd say. Another distinction, I'd just say we have 197 members in the Missouri General Assembly. That is extraordinarily high for a state of our size. I believe it's the 5th most in the country. We are not the 5th most populated state. So that does create some challenges. 163 members in the House, 34 senators. We are not all up for election at the same time. The Senate is staggered. But as Jeremy pointed out previously, term limits are a significant distinction, and something that, as we go through this conversation today, you'll learn why that's a big factor in the public policy making area. Real quick, I just wanted to point out a few kind of high-level priorities for the General Assembly this year. There's we do not have bills carry over from one session to the other like Kansas. So we have over 1,700 bills filed at the moment. Usually there's anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 at some point filed. Obviously, they do not all receive the same attention. But as Stephen said earlier, because it's an election year, I think you have kind of a whittling down of priorities that the majority party wants to focus on. And I want to just kind of rattle off a couple. I know we'll get deeper into discussion later. Let's see, last week, the governor, or the week before, the governor put out his budget recommendation. It was largely a look back at some of the successes he's had and focus on infrastructure spending. Both with bonding and with the general fund spending on the rebuilding of I-70 across the state, infrastructure in that regard, broadband infrastructure, and he's very much focused this session on a child care tax credit package. We know through several studies, including one conducted by the University of Missouri, that it looks like the Missouri economy is missing out on $1.35 billion in activity due to folks who don't enter the workforce because they don't have childcare options. So they have proposed a package sponsored by Representative Brenda Shields and Senator Lauren Arthur. So you see a bipartisan, bicameral proposal here to try to tackle that problem with a number of different tax credits. Beyond that, also budget. I know that was mentioned earlier. The last few years, we've been afforded a lot of federal money through the infrastructure bill passed, through ARPA funds. There's been a lot of one-time spending. That is, you're starting to see that rein in some. And I think with revenues, kind of flattening a little bit, legislators, particularly conservative legislators, are starting to want to kind of rein in the spending and provide for rainy day funds. So we're seeing that just a little bit. There still will be spending, but I think they are starting to recognize that. So budget is the one thing constitutionally we have to pass in Missouri, right? And it takes the entire session to get it done. There's a key component this year that is very important for the budget to pass. We have what's called the federal reimbursement allowance. This is a tax imposed by the hospitals on themselves. This is very significant. It actually equates to about $4 billion in our budget, drawn down federally. It is a huge political football in this legislative session, to say the least. A couple of years ago, when it was up for renewal, it did not get done during the regular session. The governor quickly called the legislature back in for a special session to get this done. It's a key component. It was rushed in the Senate side through committee, sponsored by the appropriations chairman, and first up on the calendar. Unfortunately, yesterday, after some negotiating, it had been laid over, meaning it's set aside for later debate. They're not quite there on the negotiation on that. So the FRA after the budget is probably the number one thing that has to be done. Beyond that, the majority party has really kind of honed it in on initiative petition reform. Over the last probably decade, we've seen, folks go to the ballot box to try to get initiatives passed where the legislature was either unwilling or unable to get things done. You've seen, obviously, we passed Medicaid expansion on the ballot. There was labor initiatives that have been overturned on it, medical, recreational marijuana. So many initiatives that the legislature wouldn't touch went through the IP process. The IP reform process has been discussed over the last couple of sessions. It's been kind of escalated this year in particular due to the fallout, if you will, from the overturning of Roe versus Wade. There's been a number of states, including Kansas and Ohio, that have moved to offer some sort of exceptions to that law. There is an effort underway in Missouri, and so you'll see conservative Republicans particularly try to prioritize getting that initiative petition reform done in order to make it more difficult to pass things on the ballot. Okay, so they want to raise the threshold from what it currently is, 50% plus one, a simple majority, to make that threshold higher to pass something and change our Constitution. So that is very much in the negotiation with the FRA. They kind of go hand in hand, which one goes first, which one goes second. So that you'll continue to hear about that. Finally, and I'll just quickly touch on these, property tax reform has been a big issue discussed in all corners of the state, very much so in Jackson County, though, obviously. So that's kind of top of mind. That's something that's going to be heavily debated. I will say that through this process in the discussion on property tax reform, we've found that various rural counties depend on their property taxes for many other services. So that's been kind of interesting to find out, and an interesting dynamic in that discussion. And then finally, education reform. It's something that the majority party has focused on for the last number of years, been unable to get across the finish line. This year, I think they are probably the best position they've ever been to come together and pass some sort of education reform model. So those are kind of high level, some of the things that they're working on. I just want to mention one more thing before I turn it over. In addition to all that, because of term limits, you have the highest number of sitting senators running for statewide office that we've ever seen. And I can't understate that enough. That is a significant issue with the public policy making process in this session. 6 of them have announced. There's questions about others, and this is anywhere from United States Senate, governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer. Also, the Speaker of the House is running statewide for lieutenant governor, and the House budget chairman is running for a statewide office. So lots of challenges ahead.
Great. Thanks, Sam, for that. And well, let's turn a little bit to nonprofits and how they the sort of issues that we should be thinking about. And how about I turn to John and Stephen on the Kansas side? The nonprofit sector covers a lot of territory, from nonprofit universities, hospital systems, rural, urban, large, small, foster care, early childhood, arts, human services. All of those are all in the nonprofit sector. Now, because we've learned that the Kansas legislature does not have term limits, so you have people there for quite a while. What's their level of knowledge of what the nonprofit sector does, the value of the sector? Do they need to be educated, or is it something where this is actually there's some really key champions there who understand what's going on?
Yeah. The short answer would be it all depends. It all depends on the entity, and it all depends on the legislator. The one thing that's consistent, and I think all 4 of us would agree, the key to all of it, whether you're a university, a hospital, a CASA, a charitable entity, the thing that resonates with any elected official is keeping it local, relating it back to their constituent and their part of the state. So that's what we counsel our folks to. At great risk, we always say, listen, 10 times out of 10, they'd rather hear from you back in their district than us, your hired mouthpiece, for lack of a better word. So engagement is key. Education is part of almost anything you do up there, because they're so distracted with so many different issues. You want to constantly re-educate them. And for new people coming in, and in Kansas, I will tell you that on average, and there's some extremes, we'll have about a 23 to 26% turnover every election cycle. And in the Senate, it's every 4 years, and the House every 2. So you're having to educate people quite a bit, the new folks that come in. But that would be my thoughts on how to stay relevant, and are you relevant? And it all relates to, are you talking to your people, and are you making sure that they know what the impact is back in your community, regardless of where you are or who you're talking to?
And I think that at the end of the day, it's a citizens' legislature. So the legislators rely on us and not-for-profits and represented companies to give them the best information. And you talk about nonprofits, I'll use a KHI, Kansas Health Institute, as an example, or the Kansas Healthcare Association, who we represent, that work with nursing homes. What are national trends that you're seeing? We don't want to go too far on point. We don't want to be bleeding edge, but how do we make sure that our policy is reflective to some extent of what national trends are? Some states that are larger, I think you have think tanks. I think that in smaller states like Kansas and Missouri, not-for-profits really take the place of think tanks, more or less. Here is what the trends are. Here's what you need to know. Here's what our national folks are telling us. And so I think that's incredibly helpful to lawmakers.
And we'll close with this, Doctor. It's our goal as we talk to our clients, whether they're new or have been with us for a while, is the goal is to make sure there's enough familiarity and enough trust between whoever we're representing and that policymaker that we become, we're in the way. We want them to be able to pick up the phone and call that not-for-profit, that client, and rely on them as a trusted resource. And that's the relationship building that happens. I'm sure it does with all of us on the phone here. Make sure there's that comfort level, their familiarity, like I said, and more importantly, trust. When an amendment is offered on the floor, they can pick up the phone and call them and say, here's what it is, what does it do? We look at that as success on our end.
That's great. Yeah. And I'd love to sort of contrast that, Jeremy, with the Missouri experience. As being a legislator yourself, you know, do you hear anything that resonates with you? Are there differences in the Missouri context?
Yeah, I think I was taking a note here as John was talking. The importance of knowing the difference, especially as nonprofits, between education and advocacy. You know, a lot of nonprofits get scared of that lobbying word and they get nervous. You know, if understanding that lobbying is both educating a lawmaker and then the actual lobbying is please vote yes on Y. And that is very, especially for nonprofits, a very small component of what you can be doing and helping yourself to that end. And to John's point, and kind of to your initial question, like what do lawmakers know about nonprofits? Many of them have been on a board or something. And so, and I find in Missouri, there seems to be this sort of, I'll call it a false confidence, because it's this constant churn. And so you just always have to be very sure of yourself. Otherwise, people around you within your caucus or as you're ascending are going to sense weakness. And so lawmakers, not entirely, but I'm being general in Missouri, are often very certain of themselves. And that can be helpful if their nonprofit experience and the boards and stuff that they came on were very capable and competent, and then they come with a fair amount of knowledge. But oftentimes they bring that lens to the table of their experience with their food pantry back home or with their CASA back home or childcare center back home. And that doesn't always translate into the entire world. Nonprofits are very diverse and the missions that we try to accomplish and ways we go about accomplishing the things that we try to do. So from that standpoint, I think the best thing for nonprofits is, like John said, to position oneself to be a trusted, reliable resource of information, where lawmakers, I mean, the ultimate success, like John said, is a lawmaker taking the initiative to call somebody on their own. But secondary to that is that they know that information coming from an organization like United We or Gift of Life or whoever, that when that information comes in, that the lawmaker can trust and know that it's going to be accurate and good, and that the people giving it are giving it with the best of intent.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Jeremy, you know, just to tee up a little nugget of information about advocacy in the nonprofit sector, last year, Independent Sector, which is a major Washington-based national representative of nonprofits, they did a study. They found that advocacy spending on advocacy has dropped by 50% with nonprofits in the past 25 years. So nonprofits are you know, doing less advocacy than they've ever done before by quite a large margin. And you know, I think that report really asked the question of, well, what does this mean for representing the viewpoint of the sector? But Sam, I do want to get to you on a slightly different topic. Which is, you know, in Jeff City, I read the Missouri Independent every day. You know, I do see a lot going on as far as the dynamics of the election year. You talked about this. Can you give us just a large overview of what's happening in the Senate? Because I hear that that's sort of a place where a
Nothing.
lot of things are getting stuck. What's
Yeah.
going on there?
Yeah. So I'm going to do my best to try to describe what's happening in the Senate.
Okay.
We have moved from the last couple of years to a largely dysfunctional Missouri Senate to a new frontier. I would say it's now a non-functional Senate at this point. Okay. We're 6 weeks into session. They have not debated a bill until yesterday, to be quite honest, as far as a legislative policy proposal. They have approved gubernatorial appointments after, a 2.5 week struggle and an overnight filibuster at one point. So since 2010, I'm going to go back real quick. There's been kind of this percolating undercurrent in the Republican Party where it's kind of started with the Tea Party, and it's essentially members of the Republican Party who are more conservative than others or claim to be, and it's materialized now into a situation where we essentially have 3 caucuses in Missouri. And I know that Kansas experienced something similar to this years ago. The supermajority has grown very big. We have gerrymandered districts in many regards. And so what that does is it creates a scenario where you need to win the primary. You don't have a competitive general election, so there's really nothing keeping you kind of more moderate or towards the center, more pragmatic. It's essentially a race to the right or left in some cases. So in the Missouri Senate, kind of how it breaks down right now is you have 3 caucuses. There's 34 members. There's 24 Republicans and 10 Democrats. However, the 10 Democrats are not the smallest caucus in that chamber. There's 7 Republicans that have joined what's now referred to as the Freedom Caucus. And these are more, extreme members of the Republican Party. They are the smallest caucus, but as has been pointed out earlier, and I know Jeremy pointed out in the thread, we have what's called a standing filibuster in Missouri. So you really have a lot of power in the Missouri Senate. Each individual senator, regardless of party or what caucus you fall into, what they have done is they've banded together and they have really dictated, particularly this year, the direction of the Senate. So much so that, as I previously referenced, the FRA bill, which was first up on the calendar and definitely the single most important piece of legislation we passed this year, has been sidelined until this group of the Freedom Caucus demand is that we pass something that defunds Planned Parenthood. And that way that they feel more comfortable with passing the FRA. They've also made a demand of passing initiative petition reform first. So a small group, really 1 senator, but certainly 2 to 3, and in this case, 7 senators can really dictate what the entire body is going to work on at any given time. So that's the scenario right now. Like I said, it's been a new frontier. I've been in the building 15 years. There's been folks there that have been there 30 plus years. I was talking to one yesterday. I don't think they've ever seen this level of dysfunction going on. And so really we're just feeling our way through and trying to see, what side will prevail. That 7, when it comes to a vote, that 7 does not have the votes, but they can hold up and stall bills very effectively. So that is where we are at.
And Sam, just following up really quickly, you said constitutionally they must pass a budget. It sort of seems like an ice jam in a river there right now where everything is backing up. but you have to imagine at some point, there's going to be a flurry of activity. Do you have any sense of, can anybody see that point happening, somewhat soon?
You know, I think even though yesterday they didn't get any legislation passed, they did take a step forward as far as in the direction they were going to debate the single piece of legislation that dealt with Planned Parenthood funding. The budget, yeah, it has to be passed by what's the first week in May, constitutionally. You know, in a lot of ways, this is how session always is, that, you know, there's a lot of things moving, but then all the activity and actual bill passage happens at the very end of session. I mean, I'd like to think that the logjam breaks at some point, but with a very limited amount of legislative pieces passing. The budget, the House will obviously take up the budget first. They start with the governor's budget recommendation and then mark up their own budget. They will certainly send it over to the Senate with plenty of time to debate. It'll start in Senate Appropriations Committee. They'll spend weeks on it, and then they will certainly take it to the floor and get it done in enough time. That's my hope anyway.
So, and just a note to everybody in the audience, throw questions in the chat if you have them. But I have a question now for Kansas on Medicaid expansion. We talked about supermajorities and the like. Now, Kansas is very different from Missouri in the sense that there's a Democratic governor. And for many years, this Medicaid expansion has been a topic of discussion. What do you think is the chance in an election year that this can get across the line in Topeka?
Yeah, it is. We thought the Medicaid expansion issue had hit a crescendo about probably 3 years ago, where there was a lot of money spent, a lot of lobbyists. The Kansas Hospital Association was kind of leading the charge, bringing in national consultants. Then it kind of died off, but the governor herself has taken this on as her #1 priority in Kansas. The problem that she has is that the Speaker of the House has taken this on as his #1 issue in opposition. And he has adopted, basically, again, for lack of a better term, it's going to happen over my dead body. And so how that affects things is any type of legislation that might be available to amend Medicaid expansion language into is not even being considered and debated on the floor. So there are pieces of good legislation that are being held hostage. And I don't mean that in a negative way. This is the political process. But that one issue is affecting policy in a lot of different areas. The governor, to her credit, has done an incredible job of a grassroots campaign of bringing it now to the forefront and creating, I guess, the messaging that there will be a high price to pay if you don't support Medicaid expansion. I'll speak to just a minute before I hand it over to Stephen about the makeup of our House and Senate. The fact that we have a Democratic governor and overwhelming Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate creates a unique procedural challenge for those of us that are trying to get policy done. If she vetoes a bill, in this case, a tax package, the Senate needs 27 votes to override that veto. They only have 28 Republicans. And there are different factions within, as Sam was mentioning. On the House side, they need 84 votes to override a governor's veto, and they have 85 Republicans. And so there is no room for error. I went off subject a little bit on Medicaid expansion, but it's an interesting dynamic of having a governor as a chief executive and then a Republican-controlled legislature. It's not quite totally dysfunctional, but they're certainly not passing as much policy as they probably could.
The only thing I'll add is, in lieu of Medicaid expansion, you may see Republicans fund different provider groups, different waivers, et cetera, in that healthcare sphere at higher levels to go back to their district and say, yeah, I know we didn't expand Medicaid, but boy, we gave a lot of money to rural hospitals, and we gave a lot of money to nursing homes, and we reduced that IDD waiting list. So we did our part, and we helped those who can't help themselves. So we may see that in this budget cycle.
Yeah, yeah. How about we turn to early childhood? I see Kristen in the chat talked a little bit about early childhood. So how about we start in Jeff City to talk about what's happening in that sphere? I know that the governor has talked a lot about this being one of his priorities. Are there any important pieces of legislation dealing with early childhood education?
Yeah, the governor's made this a top priority of his for many years as it pertains to workforce development. And the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and other chambers have united in that front. You know, people can't be at work and be productive if they don't have quality, safe places for their kids to be. And that's been an interesting transition over the last 10, 15 years in Missouri. Is there used to be a host of lawmakers that were adamantly opposed to a lot of quality components. There was quality rating systems proposed and things like that, and there was always opposition. And now there seems to be a large consensus that quality early childhood education experiences are what is important. Just having somebody there to watch your kid does not produce the outcomes that employers and future educators want. And so there's a quality component, which is really good. Last year, there was a piece of legislation that was passed to create or to help eliminate the cliff effect in terms of child care assistance. There's a lot of people in the nonprofit sector know and understand, you know, people get benefits, but if sometimes they're right at that cliff, and if they get a 50-cent an hour raise or a $1 an hour raise, it ends up being a $2 an hour loss because they lose their child care benefits and maybe a host of other benefits. So we passed a bill that allows a cliff effect fix. Now we have to get that appropriated this year. And so we'll be looking at some opportunities to get that into the budget. From a legislation standpoint, Brenda Shields has got a piece of legislation in the House to establish a child care tax credit that would it would be a refundable tax credit on people's individual income tax that would allow them to better afford child care. And so those are the bills that are kind of issues that are working their way through this year. I think if there's going to be, you know, Sam mentioned it, the road to May 17th is fraught with peril. May 17th is our constitutional end date, but the child care piece does seem to be something that I would put it having a better than 50% chance at getting through and making it to the governor's desk, and he would of course sign it. So that's what I've taken a look at and am working on a little bit this year.
Good. Okay. Yeah, and in the Kansas context, I know it's been maybe a little less highly touted, but still a very important issue. Where do we stand in early childhood education in the Kansas context?
Yeah, so in Kansas, it is, we can't focus on the education aspect until we solve the lack of provider issue. And that's really the crux here. So in 2023, the governor commissioned a task force, an early childhood transition task force that looked at a number of issues. And I think that they really want to start with that, again, that lack of providers in the state of Kansas. And they utilize some ARPA funds to try and create capacity. And they are currently now in the process, you know, you can call it a phase 2, if you will, but the legislature is looking at a proposal that would bring fragmented agencies the Department for Health and Environment, who deals with credentialing, the Department for Children and Families, who deals with foster care issues, and they deal with some of the education issues. The Children's Cabinet, which does a number of things, but they're looking to create one central cabinet level position or one central agency to handle all of this. So it would be everything from getting credentialed to finding childcare slots in one easy online portal, to finding scholarships or supplemental funds if I'm a parent and I want to put my kids in childcare. So that's kind of where we're at. That's the governor's take on it. The legislature has been a little bit more resistant. They have their own ideas. They don't want to create an agency per se. They are looking more at where can we reduce red tape to help those providers increase capacity. And so that's the battles we've been seeing the last couple of years, including a bill last year that went through to reduce regulations, and the governor vetoed it, and it was not overridden.
Mm-hmm. So we had talked a bit about budgets. We talked about having surpluses, which is better than deficits. So it's for the past few years, whether it was a COVID bump because we had funds coming from various federal transfers or otherwise, now we have this unique sort of problem of fighting over too much money, and whether we save it for a rainy day or not. So let's go back to the Kansas context and sort of think, what is the nature of the fight over surplus, and do you see status quo changing at all in what's going on right now in the budget battle?
Yeah, we'll be brief on this. I'll turn it over to Stephen again. It's funny. I bet you Jeremy and Sam have the same conversations. When you talk to appropriators, having this much money is a real burden for them, because when you don't have any money, they have a built-in excuse, and they can say, "I'd love to fund you, but we just don't have the funds." Now they have them, and they're stuck on what are our priorities. In Kansas, there's two pieces of policy that are very expensive and will curtail big chunks of revenue coming back into the state for them to disperse to wherever they want it. One is we are stair-stepping down our sales tax on food, trying to get it to zero. And the number on that is big. I think the total package was about $600 million of revenue they will never see again. So we'll start with that. And then the other is the tax relief package. Whether it be the governor's version or the legislator's version, it's inexpensive, and I think the number on that is about $500 million. So that eats into the surplus that we have that Stephen mentioned, about $3 billion.
The governor's budget, I mentioned briefly, there were a number of one-time projects that she would like to see funded: a brand new cancer center for the University of Kansas, some corrections institutions, state pay raises, reducing the liability of the state pension fund, the World Cup event, and all the money that will be required to go towards that. So that is, I would say, the battle right now is what projects, what one-time spending projects are we going to look at? And remember, this is all colored by election, because you have a fairly popular Democratic governor, a legislature where the supermajority is in the balance, and at some point we're going to have a new nominee on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, for governor. And one name that's been floated out there that is pretty well known is Lieutenant Governor Toland. So how is that push and pull going to impact things moving forward?
Yeah, and Stephen, just real quick, Kristen asked, you mentioned, I think, the cancer center, I think corrections was the second thing you had discussed.
Some big capital projects associated with corrections facilities and building those facilities.
I think it was $300 million to rebuild a prison in Hutchinson, not being very well received by legislators.
Interesting, really interesting. Well, let's talk about the Missouri side. We're a Missouri university, so I always watch the State of the State speech because I'm always trying to see what the governor says about universities and whether people roll their eyes or not. Well, how about let's talk about Jeremy and Sam, the Missouri context for the budget.
Yeah, like a lot of other states, our budget has been filled up with federal dollars over the last few years, and that's slowly starting to kind of make its way out. There's been a bit of a feeding frenzy in the legislature for the last few years, and a number of industries and folks have taken advantage of that. Sam mentioned transportation and I-70 and infrastructure, and that's been a big deal. And a number of nonprofits have been successful. I represent lots of nonprofits, and we've been able to get programs and services in the budget for the last few years. And so it's been a sweet ride, and everybody's sort of commenting that we think the gravy train may be pulling into the station at this point, where those revenues are decreasing. There was some pessimism in terms of revenue, revenue estimations. Our revenues are holding steady at this point. State revenues are, and so there's not as much constraint on the budget as folks have otherwise thought. But it's definitely not the booming 2020s like it was a few years ago. Big priorities that they've got, childcare, transportation, infrastructure, some of those big ones. But I think a lot of what they're hoping to do this year is pull back a little bit from the good times of yesterday and fund those core budgets and not have quite as many new decision items this legislative session.
Yeah. So in rounding out this discussion, back to nonprofits and how they engage in this somewhat daunting process of how they educate their legislators. John mentioned earlier about being that trusted voice from the district. Sam, how about I'll turn to you. Say you're a nonprofit here in Kansas City, fairly well known, but certainly may not have ever engaged a lobbyist before. What do you do? What should you do?
Yeah. And everything that was previously mentioned from John and Jeremy, I mean, I would absolutely endorse. It is about making that connection. I mean, my first thing to say is of course, with term limits, you have to constantly be educating them on how things are affecting you, what's going on with your nonprofit, and the knowledge does vary quite a bit, as Jeremy pointed out, from lawmaker to lawmaker. And you need to point out the variation between nonprofits, right? Because that varies. I mean, I represent Children's Mercy Hospital. Issues are different for them than another small, food pantry, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Never. So you have to continually be educating. And the one piece of advice I would give is just to stay out of the politics, to focus on the issues, leave your politics at home. You're someone you adamantly disagree with on a number of fronts, could be your biggest champion in the legislature on your issue. And so it's important to stay focused on your issues with them and educate them and be that trusted source for them and explaining to them how things affect you and what, legislative piece or what budget item you need and why and how that's going to make a difference for the people back home for them.
It's wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like a step forward and something very doable for these nonprofits. So I want to thank our guest today. I want to give a special thanks to Matt Hayes. Matt is our external relations person here at UMKC, but also somebody who has a long, professional history in this arena. And so thank you, Matt, for getting our guests together. Again, thanks to John, Stephen, Sam, and Jeremy for a great discussion. And thanks for our guests or for our attendees to be here today, and look forward to further discussions. Thanks so much.